Oh gosh, look at the crowd.
Come this way.
Those who spread goodness radiate happiness to everyone around them. Introducing LOLC Finance Credit Cards. Fuel the goodness in you.
Welcome to LMDtv. I'm Ashwini Vethakan. Joining us this week on Talking Business is the Program Manager for Women in Work Sri Lanka at IFC, Sarah Twigg. Welcome to the show, Sarah. It's good to have you with us.
Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now, Sarah, when it comes to workplace inclusivity, more specifically gender-based inclusion, what are your thoughts on the performance of the private sector?
A very good question. So I would say there's been progress in some areas, but there is still a long way to go. So if we look at a very basic metric like female labour force participation, we see that that's really been stagnant for about the last 2 decades at around about 30-35%. Now, given how high women's educational attainment is in Sri Lanka, that's a pretty staggeringly low number. And if you look at the rate today, which is around about 35%, which means roughly 1 out of every 3 women of working age are employed, it's less than half that of men. So really, it's a very low number. We also see that women in the age groups of 20 to 24 are the most disadvantaged. So they're 6 times more likely than women in other age groups to be unemployed. So clearly there is an impact around marriage, child rearing, household responsibilities that is resulting in a large proportion of women not participating in the workforce. And this has consequences, obviously, for the economy. It means that there is a huge pool of talented, educated women out there who are not gainfully employed. And so that's a real opportunity. And what we find is that the companies who we see that are creating environments that are really supportive of both women and men are really seeing progress, and they're really seeing great business benefits. So, for example, we're seeing a lot more companies really taking this issue seriously and really focusing on what they can do to create more gender equal workplaces. And that could include things like putting in place flexible work options so that people can manage their home responsibilities as well as their work responsibilities. It can relate to family-friendly policies like having childcare support or providing staff with access to childcare services when they need them. It also includes things like family-friendly policies such as childcare support, having access to childcare services for staff who need them. And then it also includes things like leadership programs, training, mentoring, making sure that women have the kinds of support they need to work their way through the pipeline up into leadership positions and into decision-making positions. And as I mentioned, these companies not only have access to a greater diversity of talent, but they also see business benefits like increased productivity, improved financial performance, and not surprisingly, improved employee well-being. In terms of IFC, gender is very much part of our core business strategy. In Sri Lanka, this is reflected through the Women in Work program, which is a 5-year partnership with the Australian government. It's IFC's largest single gender program anywhere in the world, so it's really a very important part of our work. And through this program, we look at the challenges that are prevalent for women across the private sector, from employment to access to financial services, as well as to around entrepreneurship. And what we really aim to do is to bring together stakeholders from the private sector, government policymakers, communities, business owners, and to really help to address the challenges that women are facing and to create more opportunities for women across the private sector.
So then what role, if any, has this had on the IFC's She Works initiative?
Yes, absolutely. So under the IFC DFAT Women in Work program, as I mentioned, one of the core areas that we're working on is to enhance women's employment in the private sector. And so what we've done through the She Works partnership was we worked with 15 of the country's leading companies who collectively employ over 170,000 employees to help them create more equal and respectful workplaces for the women and men that they employ. And we worked with businesses across industries, so garments, tourism, IT, banking and finance, conglomerates, really across the whole business sector. And what we saw was among these companies, we worked with them for 2 years, we saw a really significant level of impact and progress. Across these companies, they implemented 97 different actions focusing on increasing women in leadership, increasing women's recruitment, retention of women, as I mentioned earlier, things around supported childcare, anti-sexual harassment mechanisms, as well as supporting women business owners in their supply chains. And through the course of those 2 years, what we found was that at the end of it, those companies collectively employed 12,000 more women than they did at the start. There was a 1/3 increase in the share of women who were on their boards of directors. So that's a very significant increase. We found that more parents, so both mothers and fathers, reported that they were able to stay employed and to focus on their jobs thanks to having access to some form of childcare support that they didn't previously have. And we found really fabulously that more employers were putting women into non-traditional jobs, so working in more male-dominated roles. And one of the fabulous examples that always brings a smile to my face is the South Asia Gateway Terminal and the Colombo ports, who now have women operating those enormous cranes that sit on the port and which offload and unload things onto the ships. So really some fantastic progress. And not only did we see that progress, but we also saw that these companies were reporting both increased employee satisfaction as well as increased business productivity. So really kind of positive results all round.
Now, Sarah, how has the IFC looked to engage the private sector, and are there any plans to include the public sector?
So our mandate is really to work with the private sector. And so what we're aiming to do is, by working with these private sector organisations, that we're then demonstrating to other businesses as well as to the public sector the kinds of things and kind of actions that businesses can take to create more diverse and more gender equal workplaces. And so on the back of the success of SheWorks, and really what we found was very, very strong demand from other companies to have a similar set of supports, is that we're now working with the Federation of Chambers of Commerce and Industry, and we're delivering a similar program, but to many more companies. So we've got over 40 companies who we're working with under the Together We Can campaign, where we will again share experiences, expertise, and practical tips on how companies can create gender equal workplaces. And these companies will not only benefit from IFC's global expertise, but they'll also be able to learn directly from those SheWorks companies. So the SheWorks companies will be able to share their own experiences, their own things that they've tried, what's worked, what hasn't worked. And so other businesses will really be able to benefit from that experience and from that knowledge base. And I think one of the things that's really important in the current context is that with this group of companies and with the Federation of Chambers of Commerce, we're going to be really focusing on how companies can utilise gender equality approaches to help them weather the COVID pandemic. So really looking at the types of issues that their employees are facing when it comes to things like mental health, the need for flexibility, the importance of having respectful workplaces where people are free from bullying, from harassment, and really working to use all of these kind of tools to help companies actually manage through the COVID pandemic. And I think this is particularly important right now because we're seeing both in Sri Lanka as well as globally that the pandemic has really had a disproportionate impact on women's economic participation. We're seeing that a number of the areas where we had been seeing progress in terms of gender equality are starting to backslide. So it's really important that right now companies are taking a very proactive approach to making sure that they're retaining their female workforce, that they're actively recruiting and actively promoting women.
With women comprising of less than half of our labour force, do you believe the country is doing enough to include this segment into our workforce stream?
Look, I think there has been a lot of work, and I think there has definitely been progress. But I also think there's a long way to go. And as we discussed, women's labour force participation hasn't really changed for the past 2 decades. And given the high educational attainments of women, that's really surprising, and it's really a missed opportunity. And we also see, in terms of some global metrics, that these relatively low economic outcomes for women are also reflected in terms of Sri Lanka's global rankings. So, for example, the Global Gender Gap Index, which looks at economic participation, education, health, and political empowerment. Now, as of the latest report, Sri Lanka stands at 102 out of 153 countries on this ranking. well below neighbours like Bangladesh, who ranks 50, and Nepal, that ranks 101st. And this is particularly concerning because Sri Lanka performs among the top countries when it comes to the education and the health indicators. So really the main drivers behind Sri Lanka's lower ranking is its low performance in terms of the economic dimensions, where it ranks 126th, as well as in terms of political participation. It's not all doom and gloom, however. We are seeing progress, as I mentioned, among a large number of companies, but we're also seeing progress when it comes to women in top management. So obviously a really critical piece of the puzzle is getting more women into decision-making positions, which will also lead to more women coming up through the ranks. And when we look at women on boards in particular, and through our Women in Work program with DFAT, we've been working with the Colombo Stock Exchange. And we have a new report coming out on the case for gender diversity among Sri Lanka's business leadership. And we're seeing a positive trend when it comes to women on the boards of listed companies in particular. There was just over 8% of women board directors in 2018. And that's up to 9.5% this year. So while that might not sound like a huge growth, in terms of the types of progress we're seeing globally, that is actually really significant. And the other thing that we've found is that those companies that have more women in their leadership teams, they also perform better on a number of business metrics, such as return on investment, such as price to earnings ratios. So not only are they having a greater diversity of thought, they're also leading to better business outcomes. So that's, I think, it's a glass half full, if you like. There's work to be done, but we are seeing things moving in the right direction.
And on that note, we'll be going in for a short break. Welcome back to the show as we continue our conversation with the Program Manager of the Women in Work Sri Lanka at IFC, Sarah Twigg. Sarah, what type of initiatives should private and public sector financial service institutions engage in to encourage more women to join the industry?
Look, I think the types of initiatives are generally similar, whether you're a public sector, a private sector institution, a financial services institution, or another type of business. Many of the approaches would be very similar. I think one of the old sayings that I think rings very true in this space is what gets measured gets done. So one of the things that I would really encourage is that businesses should start tracking. Start understanding where are women and men in their organizations, what types of jobs are they in, where are they in terms of the different job levels, and then measuring what happens when you're actually making changes. If you're trying out new interventions, what are the impacts that come from those? And as part of that, it's also really important to understand what are some of the drivers behind women's low participation. What are some of the reasons why women aren't in the workforce? We've already talked about challenges around household and childcare responsibilities. Lack of access to flexible work practices, which is still relatively new for many companies in Sri Lanka. One of the things we also see is women often lack opportunities for growth or for promotion, and so that can also lead to them leaving the workforce, as well as issues around bullying and sexual harassment in the workforce, which can discourage women from joining or from staying in the workforce. Now, all of these issues also impact men, but we do find that they disproportionately impact women. And so when we see companies who proactively tackle some of these barriers, they have a number of benefits. And as I mentioned earlier, supporting childcare. So one of the interventions that we've seen companies put in place is around childcare supports. And so what we found among SheWorks companies, for example, was that family commitments were among the top 3 reasons for both women and men to leave the workforce when we started the SheWorks program. Over the course of the program, 8 companies actually proactively implemented supports related to childcare. And by the end of the 2 years, those companies who had implemented some support found that family commitments was no longer among the top 3 reasons for either women or men to be leaving the workforce. We've also found that policies around flexibility can be a real game changer, especially in the current context where families are juggling kids at home, increased care responsibilities, increased household responsibilities. And so giving staff the flexibility to manage their home and work responsibilities can be a real motivator and can really help staff to be able to be fully present and fully engaged in work and in delivering what they need to deliver for work while also managing their home responsibilities. We've also found that putting in place proactive approaches to advancing women in leadership positions can be a really important way of making sure that you're not losing women through the course of their career. And so this can include things like leadership training, it can be mentoring programs, it might be having succession plans in place, but also making sure that women get access to the types of career critical assignments that they need so that they've got the right skills that they need to take on those more senior roles. And as I mentioned, when we looked at the top 30 listed companies in Sri Lanka, we found that those with a greater diversity of senior leadership had really positive outcomes in terms of some of their financial metrics. So it's not only good for the employees, it's also fundamentally very good for the business.
Now, what role does the disparity in income play when it comes to the lower workforce labour participation rate amongst women?
Indeed, income inequality is a really important part of the picture, both here and globally. One of the things we found is that there's not a lot of data in Sri Lanka in terms of what is the income gap. However, the ILO did a study in 2012, and in that study they found that male workers earn around 30 to 35% more than women in private sector organisations for the same roles. And so while we don't have good data on specifically what's driving this gap, I think we can, some of the likely reasons are related to the general undervaluation of the type of work that women do, issues to do with occupational segregation. So what we find is that women are more likely to work in lower value jobs or in sectors with lower wages overall. So for example, if you think of, the prevalence of women in the garment sector, the prevalence of women in more administrative, more junior or more unskilled roles. So naturally they will be bringing in a lower income. And it's also to do with societal expectations. So, if women are seen as dependents generally rather than breadwinners, and then therefore they're more likely to have more care and more household responsibilities, all of these things play into the difference in income that women and men are bringing in. On the upside, though, we're seeing that many progressive employers, and a great example is Standard Chartered Bank, are really actively measuring the gender wage gap in their organisations. And then they're taking action to address any inequalities that they find. And so what they're doing is they're making sure that employees who have a similar level of education, a similar level of responsibility, and a similar level of job role are actually receiving the same employment benefits than they might otherwise have been. And so I think that's something that many more companies can do, is to just, as I said, just measure it, just look internally at what your salaries look like across your employee base, and to really identify whether there is a gap. And to do something about it if there is.
Our final question for this evening, Sarah. How is the IFC investing in helping the rural women entrepreneurs?
So one of the 3 areas that the Women in Work program focuses on is around increasing access to financial services for women and for women-owned businesses. And so this is one of the key ways that we are reaching women entrepreneurs in the rural areas. And so the work that I mentioned earlier with banks such as NDB and Commercial Bank is helping those rural women to access the financing they need to start a business, to help grow their business. And so, for example, at NDB Bank, through the initial round of new women's focused products that they've launched, they've seen already a 36% increase in the value of loans that are going to women and SMEs. So these products are working. They're actually helping women to access the financing that they need. Another key area that we're working on is around insurance. And this is really critical for women entrepreneurs and again, also very critical for women in rural areas, but is not an area that women have previously been very well served. So we have a partnership with AAA Sri Lanka, and we're helping AAA to develop a women's insurance strategy that will see more Sri Lankan women, including, of course, rural women and women business owners, to be better able to access the types of insurance that they need. So these will be products that are very tailored to what women need, and they will be delivered to them in a way that suits their needs specifically. Another thing that we've been doing is working jointly with the central bank to develop the country's first national financial inclusion strategy. And through doing this, we took a gender-sensitive approach right from the outset. Part of this inclusion strategy has included a big focus on digital financial inclusion, and in particular, digital financial inclusion for rural women. So looking to bring even some of the smallest transactions into the formal banking system. And we have a wonderful example of Siriwati, who is a business owner. She has a business selling tambali. And if you'd met her a year ago, she would have had very little knowledge of formal financial services, very little understanding of the formal financial sector. But thanks to the digital finance drive, which we've rolled out as part of the National Financial Inclusion Strategy, Siriwati now is a banker. She's a customer of a bank, and she's using digital financial products to sell her products. So, for example, if you stop by her Tambili store, you can use a QR code on your phone to buy your Tambili. And this is just one example of the ways that things like digital financial inclusion are really helping, in particular, rural women and rural business owners to be integrated more formally into the financial services sector.
Well, this has definitely been an interesting conversation and has shed some light towards the IFC's She Works initiative. Thank you for joining us on the show this evening, Sarah.
Thanks very much for having me. It's been a real pleasure.
Coming up, we have the latest from the LMD-NielsenIQ Business Confidence Index. Stay tuned.
You love the feeling of being renewed. To stay beautiful every single day. To breathe just like we do, because you are truly delicate, protecting the ones who've been with us through the years. With Sayalac Care, the only wood coating that truly protects you. Sayalac Wood Coatings from JAT.
Welcome back to the show, and here's the latest from the BCI. The latest results of the LMD-NielsenIQ Business Confidence Index, which was conducted before Budget 2022 was presented in Parliament, point to a deterioration in sentiment among Sri Lanka's business community. The BCI registered a slight fall of 2 basis points to 109 in November, following 3 consecutive months of increases. However, this marks an improvement compared to where the index stood a year ago at 91 and places it 3 points above the 12-month average. NielsenIQ's Director of Consumer Insights, Terika Mienadenia, offers insights into the latest survey's results. The COVID-19 situation has abated and the country has finally opened up, with provincial travel restrictions lifted and schools also opening. But the havoc caused by the virus is being felt acutely in every segment of society. Commenting on the future of the BCI, Mienadenia says, "The road to recovery looks steep, with much sacrifice and effort needed from businesses and the people. With the budget proposals not offering any concessions for either segment, it is likely that both the BCI and the Consumer Confidence Index, or CCI, will either stay the same or decline once more." Amid concerns being raised about the government's approach to meeting Budget 2022's revenue targets, as the country continues to tackle economic uncertainties on multiple fronts, as well as fears about another wave of the pandemic, it seems unlikely that business confidence will see a drastic improvement, not unless these challenges are addressed. What's more, the budget's proposals are likely to dampen confidence in the near term at least, given the reactions of chambers of commerce and business people in general. And that's all we have for you this week. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Thank you for watching and stay safe.